What if I told you that beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, in chambers that have never seen sunlight, lies evidence of the most forbidden ritual in Christian history? What if the very heart of Rome, the eternal city built on 7 hills, was once the stage for an occult ceremony so dangerous that its memory was erased from every official record? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we're descending into the shadows of Imperial Rome, where ambition and desperation drove men to attempt the unthinkable. This isn't just another story about ancient superstition or medieval folklore. This is about a ritual so potent, so terrifying in its implications, that it changed the course of an empire and left scars on the city that can still be felt today. But before we begin, let me warn you, what you're about to hear has been buried for nearly 2,000 years. Scholars have debated its existence, theologians have denied its possibility, and historians have dismissed it as myth. Yet, the evidence remains, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the sanitized versions of history we've been taught. In this investigation, I'm going to reveal not just what happened, but how it happened, who was involved, and most importantly, what came after. We'll explore the forgotten chambers beneath Rome, where the ritual took place, examine the ancient texts that describe the ceremony in chilling detail, and uncover the political conspiracy that made such an act not just possible, but inevitable. I've spent months researching this story, poring over manuscripts that most people will never see, consulting with experts who've dedicated their lives to understanding the darker aspects of Roman history. What I discovered will challenge everything you think you know about the fall of the empire and the rise of Christianity in Europe. The year was 67 AD, and Rome was burning. Not literally, though the Great Fire was still fresh in everyone's memory. This was a different kind of burning, a slow, consuming flame of paranoia, political upheaval, and religious persecution that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. Emperor Nero, already infamous for his cruelty and excess, had reached a level of desperation that would drive him to seek help from forces that no Roman emperor should ever have dared to contact. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. The ritual didn't fail. Something answered the call, something that had been waiting beneath the 7 hills of Rome since before the first stone was laid. Something that had watched the rise of the Republic, the birth of the empire, and the spread of Christianity with ancient, patient eyes. The evidence begins with a name, whispered in the darkest corners of Roman society. Marcus Valerius Corvus, a man whose very existence has been scrubbed from most historical records, yet whose influence can be traced through a web of political assassinations, mysterious deaths, and supernatural occurrences that plagued Rome for decades after that fateful night in 67 AD. Corvus wasn't just any Roman citizen. He was what the ancient texts call a haruspex maximus, a master of divination who could read the will of the gods in the entrails of sacrificed animals. But that's where the official records end and the real story begins. Because Corvus had studied more than just Roman augury. He had delved into the forbidden knowledge of the Etruscans, those mysterious people who ruled central Italy before Rome even existed. The Etruscans possessed secrets that Rome had tried to suppress for centuries. They understood death differently than the Romans. Where Romans feared the underworld and sought to appease the spirits of the dead, Etruscans believed that death was merely another state of being, one that could be navigated, controlled, and even exploited by those with the proper knowledge. It was this Etruscan wisdom that Corvus would eventually use to open a doorway that should have remained forever sealed. The political situation in Rome during the summer of 67 AD was beyond desperate. Nero faced rebellion in Gaul, unrest in Judea, and growing discontent among the Roman elite who saw his rule as increasingly erratic and dangerous. The emperor, who had once enjoyed the adoration of the masses, now found himself isolated, paranoid, and convinced that enemies lurked in every shadow. Traditional Roman religion offered no solutions. The gods seemed to have abandoned their chosen people. Sacrifices went unanswered, omens were uniformly dark, and even the most experienced priests could offer no guidance. It was in this atmosphere of spiritual bankruptcy that whispers began to reach the imperial palace about a man who claimed to possess knowledge beyond the realm of the traditional gods. Marcus Valerius Corvus had spent years building his reputation in the underground networks of Rome's occult practitioners. While the official priesthoods maintained their public ceremonies and state-sanctioned rituals, a shadow religion had been growing in the city's depths. Practitioners of Egyptian magic, Persian mystery cults, and most dangerously, the ancient Etruscan death rites had found refuge in the abandoned tunnels and forgotten chambers that honeycombed the ground beneath Rome. These weren't mere fortune tellers or charlatans seeking to exploit the fears of the superstitious. These were serious students of forces that mainstream Roman society had declared too dangerous to acknowledge. They understood that the gods of the underworld possessed powers that the celestial deities could never match, and they were willing to pay the price necessary to access those powers. When word of Corvus and his abilities finally reached Nero's inner circle, the emperor was intrigued despite himself. Here was a man who claimed not just to predict the future, but to change it, not through prayer or sacrifice to the established gods, but through direct negotiation with entities that existed outside the normal cosmic order. The meeting between Nero and Corvus took place in secret, in a chamber deep beneath the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's palace stood. What was discussed in that midnight conference has never been recorded in any official document, but the results speak for themselves. Within days, arrangements were being made for a ceremony unlike anything Rome had ever witnessed. The location chosen for the ritual was not random. Beneath the Circus Maximus, in caverns that predated the founding of Rome itself, lay a chamber that the Etruscans had once used for their most sacred and terrible ceremonies. The walls bore inscriptions in a language that few could read, and fewer still dared to speak aloud. These weren't mere decorations or historical curiosities. They were instructions, a step-by-step guide for contacting intelligences that dwelt in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Corvus had studied these inscriptions for years, cross-referencing them with Egyptian papyri, Persian tablets, and fragments of even older texts that spoke of beings who had ruled the earth before humanity learned to build cities or worship gods. What he had discovered was a method for summoning something that the Romans called the Princeps Tenebrarum, the Prince of Shadows, an entity that offered power beyond imagination to those bold enough to call upon it. But this was no simple invocation or prayer. The ritual described in the Etruscan inscriptions required specific conditions, precise timing, and most importantly, a sacrifice of such magnitude that it would serve as both payment and anchor for the entity's manifestation in the physical world. The preparations began in absolute secrecy. Nero's most trusted agents scoured the empire for the materials that Corvus claimed were essential for the ceremony. These weren't the usual offerings of wine, oil, and incense that characterized normal Roman religious practices. What Corvus required was far more disturbing and spoke to the true nature of what they were attempting to accomplish. First, they needed blood from 7 different sources, each representing a different aspect of Roman society. The blood of a slave, a citizen, a soldier, a priest, a virgin, a mother, and finally, a member of the imperial family itself. This last requirement meant that Nero would have to participate directly in the ritual, offering his own blood as the final component of the summoning circle. Second, they required objects of power from Rome's conquered territories, a golden amulet from Egypt inscribed with hieroglyphs that hurt the eyes to look upon directly, a silver mirror from Persia that reflected not the viewer's face, but something else entirely, something that seemed to move independently in the polished surface. A bronze dagger from Germania, its blade etched with runes that seemed to shift and change when observed in flickering torchlight. Most disturbing of all, they needed what Corvus called the final key, an artifact so dangerous that even describing it fully was said to invite catastrophe. This was a skull, ancient beyond measure, carved with symbols that predated any known civilization. Where Corvus had acquired this relic and what civilization had created, it remains a mystery that scholars still debate today. The timing of the ritual was crucial. It had to take place during the new moon, when the barrier between worlds was at its thinnest. More specifically, it had to occur during a lunar eclipse, when the moon itself would be swallowed by shadow, and the normal celestial order would be temporarily disrupted. The eclipse of September 67th AD provided the perfect opportunity. As astronomical records confirm, this was a total lunar eclipse, visible from Rome, one that would last for over an hour and cast the city into an unnatural darkness that even the most rational citizens found deeply unsettling. On the night of the eclipse, as the moon began to dim in the sky above, Nero and a small group of his most loyal followers descended into the tunnels beneath the Circus Maximus. They carried with them the materials that Corvus had specified, along with oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls as they made their way deeper into the earth. The chamber they sought lay at the end of a passage so narrow that they had to walk single file, the weight of Rome's 7 hills pressing down above them. The air grew thick and stale, carrying scents that seemed to come from another age entirely. Strange sounds echoed from the darkness ahead, sounds that might have been the settling of ancient stone or something else entirely, something that moved in the shadows just beyond the reach of their flickering lights. When they finally reached the ritual chamber, even Nero, hardened by years of witnessing the worst excesses of imperial power, was shaken by what they found. The Etruscan inscriptions covered every surface, seeming to writhe and pulse in the lamplight as if they were alive. In the center of the room stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained with substances that no amount of time or weather could wash clean. But it wasn't the physical aspects of the chamber that disturbed them most. It was the sense of presence, the undeniable feeling that they were not alone in that ancient space. Something was already there, waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of their lights. Something that had been patient for centuries, but was now stirring to wakefulness. As the eclipse reached its peak above, Corvus began the ritual, exactly as the Etruscan texts prescribed. The 7 types of blood were mixed in a golden chalice and poured out in a complex pattern around the altar. The artifacts from the conquered territories were placed at specific points that corresponded to ancient star positions, creating a geometric design that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. As the ceremony progressed and the eclipse deepened above, the very air in the chamber began to change. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid atmosphere. The flames of their oil lamps began to flicker and dance, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. But these were just the beginning signs of what was to come. As Corvus spoke, the words written on those ancient walls, words in a language that predated Latin, Greek, or any tongue known to civilized men, reality itself seemed to bend around them. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the movement of the earth above. It was a pulse, steady and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something impossibly vast, sleeping far below. The Etruscan inscriptions on the walls started to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, as if the very stone was responding to the words Corvus spoke. With increasing urgency, Nero watched in fascination and growing terror as the ritual proceeded according to the ancient formula. The emperor had witnessed countless executions, gladiatorial combats, and public spectacles designed to showcase the power of Rome. But this was different. This was power of an entirely different order, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of imperial authority or divine favor. The carved skull that Corvus had placed at the center of the altar began to resonate with the pulsing energy that filled the chamber. Hairline cracks appeared in its surface, glowing with the same eerie light that emanated from the wall inscriptions. Through these cracks, something dark and viscous began to seep, pooling around the base of the skull and spreading across the altar's stained surface. As the eclipse reached totality above ground, plunging Rome into complete darkness, the ritual entered its final phase. Corvus raised the Germanic dagger high above his head, its runic blade now blazing with cold fire that cast no heat, but somehow made the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The Persian mirror, positioned to reflect the altar, showed not the scene before them, but something else entirely. A vast space filled with moving shapes that defied description. The temperature in the chamber continued to drop until frost began forming on the stone walls. Their breath came in great white clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than natural physics would allow. The very atmosphere had become thick and resistant, as if they were breathing liquid rather than air. Then Corvus spoke the final word of the invocation, a syllable so alien to human speech that it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The sound echoed in the chamber far longer than it should have, growing in volume rather than fading, until it became a roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The response was immediate and terrifying. The darkness in the chamber deepened beyond anything they had ever experienced, a blackness so complete that it seemed to have physical weight and substance. Their oil lamps continued to burn, but the light they produced was swallowed by the surrounding void, creating tiny islands of illumination that only made the encompassing darkness more oppressive. From somewhere in that absolute blackness came a presence that dwarfed anything they had imagined possible. This wasn't the manifestation of a god or demon from Roman mythology, with recognizable form and comprehensible motivations. This was something primordial, an intelligence so ancient and alien that human minds could barely register its existence without fracturing under the strain. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, reverberating through the stone, through their bones, through the very core of their being. The words weren't heard so much as felt, each syllable pressing against their consciousness like physical blows. Who dares wake the sleeper beneath the 7 hills? Who calls upon bowers that were old when your room was nothing but shepherds' huts on muddy riverbanks? Corvus, his face pale but his voice steady, responded with the formal greeting prescribed in the Etruscan texts. He identified himself as a seeker of knowledge, a student of the ancient ways, who came bearing proper offerings and seeking audience with the Prince of Shadows. The entity's laughter was like the sound of mountains cracking, a noise that seemed to originate from the deepest foundations of the earth itself. Knowledge, you say? Power, more likely. The little emperor beside you reeks of desperation and fear. His empire crumbles, his enemies gather, and he seeks to bargain with forces beyond his understanding. Nero, despite his terror, managed to find his voice. I am Caesar, ruler of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. I offer tribute to secure aid against my enemies. Caesar. The entity's voice carried such contempt that the words seemed to physically burn in the air. Emperors rise and fall like waves upon the shore. I have watched a dozen empires claim eternal dominion, and I have seen their stones ground to dust. Your room is no different, little Caesar. It too shall fall, and its fall has already begun. The darkness around them seemed to pulse with malevolent amusement. But perhaps that fall can be guided. Perhaps it can be made to serve purposes greater than the petty ambitions of mortal rulers. Yes, I will accept your tribute. I will grant you power, but the price will be higher than you imagine, and the payment will be extracted not just from you, but from your city, your people, and your successors for generations to come. Corvus stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled despite the cosmic horror surrounding them. Name your terms, Prince of Shadows. What do you require? The entity's presence seemed to expand, filling not just the chamber, but pressing against the boundaries of reality itself. First, blood. Not the drops you have already spilled, but rivers of it. Your empire's wars must multiply. Your conquests must become more brutal. Your entertainments more savage. Every death in your name will strengthen the connection between your world and mine. The second demand was even more disturbing. Your new religion, this Christianity that spreads like a disease through your territories, must be nurtured even as you persecute it. The martyrs' deaths will serve my purposes as well as their gods. Pain and faith combined create opportunities. Nero frowned, confused by this seeming contradiction. You want me to both persecute and protect the Christians? I want you to create martyrs, little Caesar. Suffering sanctifies, and sanctification opens doorways. Every Christian who dies for their faith creates a crack in the barrier between worlds. In time, those cracks will become chasms. The third and final demand chilled them to the bone. When your reign ends, as it must, you will ensure that this chamber remains accessible. You will leave signs, markers, instructions for those who come after. This ritual will be performed again and again, and each time the barriers will weaken further. What you begin tonight is not a single act of summoning, but the first step in a process that will take centuries to complete. The entity's presence began to coalesce into something almost visible, a towering shadow that seemed to contain multitudes of smaller shadows, all writhing and shifting in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Do you accept these terms, little Caesar? Will you bind your empire to powers that predate the gods themselves? Nero looked around the chamber, at the glowing inscriptions, at the frost forming on the walls, at the terror written on the faces of his companions. Above ground, Rome waited in the unnatural darkness of the eclipse, unaware that their emperor was about to make a bargain that would doom them all. The political calculation was simple. Without supernatural aid, his reign would end within months, probably in assassination or suicide. With it, he might secure enough power to crush his enemies and restore order to the empire. The long-term consequences seemed abstract compared to the immediate crisis he faced. "I accept," Nero said, his voice barely above a whisper. The entity's satisfaction was palpable, a wave of cold triumph that washed over them like ice water. Then let the binding be sealed. What happened next defied every law of nature and reason. The carved skull split open completely, releasing not just the dark fluid, but something that could only be described as concentrated shadow, a substance that was neither liquid nor gas, but possessed properties of both. This shadowy essence flowed across the altar and began to form shapes, sigils, and symbols that burned themselves into the stone with permanent fire. The Persian mirror cracked from edge to edge, but the cracks formed a pattern, a map of sorts that seemed to show not geographical features, but temporal ones, moments in history when the barriers between worlds would be at their weakest. The Germanic dagger's blade turned black as night, and when Corvus tested its edge against his palm, the blood that flowed was no longer red, but dark as ink. The Egyptian amulet grew so hot that it began to melt, its golden surface flowing like water, while the hieroglyphs rearranged themselves into new configurations. These new symbols seemed to move independently, crawling across the molten surface in patterns that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. As the binding ritual reached its completion, the entity began to fade, but its final words echoed in the chamber with the weight of prophecy. "Remember this night, little Caesar. Remember that power always demands payment, and the bills will come due long after you have returned to dust. Your Rome will burn again, and when it does, what you have awakened will walk freely in the world above." The presence withdrew, leaving behind only the transformed artifacts and the lingering sense that something fundamental had changed in the very nature of reality. The eclipse above began to wane, allowing moonlight to filter down through cracks in the earth. But the light seemed different somehow, tinged with shadows that had not been there before. Corvus gathered the altered objects with trembling hands, wrapping them in silk cloth that immediately began to absorb their unnatural emanations. These would become the tools for future rituals, he explained to the shaken emperor. The binding was only the beginning. As they made their way back through the narrow passages toward the surface, none of them spoke about what they had witnessed. Some experiences are too vast, too alien for human language to encompass. But all of them understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. When they finally emerged into the night air above, Rome lay spread before them under the waning eclipse. The city appeared unchanged, its buildings and streets exactly as they had left them hours earlier. But they knew better. Something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic order, and the consequences of that change would ripple through history for centuries to come. The immediate effects of the ritual became apparent within days. Nero's enemies began dying in ways that defied explanation, struck down by sudden illnesses, freak accidents, and mysterious disappearances. His military campaigns became more successful, but also more brutal, as if guided by an intelligence that understood warfare on levels beyond human comprehension. The persecution of Christians intensified, but paradoxically, their numbers grew even faster. Every martyrdom seemed to inspire a dozen new conversions, creating exactly the cycle of suffering and sanctification that the entity had demanded. The blood that flowed in the arena and on the crosses began to accumulate a spiritual weight that pressed against the boundaries of the visible world. But power gained through such means carries its own corruption. And Nero soon discovered that his bargain with the Prince of Shadows came with hidden costs that grew more apparent with each passing month. The corruption began subtly, as corruption always does. Nero found himself drawn to the transformed artifacts that Corvus had retrieved from the ritual chamber, objects that now pulsed with an energy that seemed to respond to his emotional state. When anger flared within him, the Germanic dagger would grow warm against his skin. When paranoia gripped his mind, the fractured Persian mirror would show glimpses of conspiracies, both real and imagined. But it was the changes in his dreams that truly revealed the price of his bargain. Sleep no longer brought rest, but visions of vast underground spaces where things that had never been human moved through corridors of living stone. He would wake with the taste of copper in his mouth and the sound of that inhuman laughter echoing in his ears. Corvus, meanwhile, had become something more and less than the man who had descended into those tunnels. The Haruspex Maximus now spoke with authority that came not from years of study, but from direct communion with intelligences that existed outside the normal flow of time. His predictions became unnaturally accurate. His understanding of political movements almost supernatural in its precision. Yet those closest to him noticed disturbing changes in his behavior. He no longer ate regular food, sustaining himself on substances that he prepared in secret rituals performed in the depths of his private chambers. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that made his veins visible beneath the surface, and those veins pulsed with a rhythm that did not match any human heartbeat. The effects spread beyond the immediate participants in the ritual. Throughout Rome, sensitive individuals began experiencing phenomena that had no rational explanation. Priests reported that their sacred animals were behaving strangely, refusing to approach certain altars and temples. Augurs found their traditional methods of divination producing results that contradicted centuries of established practice. In the Jewish quarter, rabbis spoke in hushed tones of dreams that came to multiple members of their community simultaneously. visions of a great darkness spreading beneath the city like roots of some malevolent tree. Christian communities reported similar experiences, their leaders interpreting these signs as harbingers of the end times prophesied in their scriptures. The gladiatorial games, always brutal, took on an almost ritualistic quality that disturbed even the most bloodthirsty spectators. Deaths in the arena began to follow patterns that seemed choreographed by some unseen intelligence. The blood that soaked into the sand of the Circus Maximus carried with it an energy that sensitives could feel from blocks away. Nero's persecution of the Christians intensified according to the entity's demands, but the results defied all logical expectation. Each public execution created more converts than a dozen successful missionary journeys might have accomplished. The deaths seemed to carry a spiritual weight that pressed against the consciousness of witnesses, compelling them to add the very faith they had come to see destroyed. Marcus Valerius Corvus documented these changes in a journal written in a cipher that combined Latin characters with symbols that appeared nowhere else in recorded history. These writings, discovered centuries later by scholars who could only partially decode their meaning, describe a room transforming into something that existed partially in the physical world and partially in spaces that human language cannot adequately describe. The weather patterns above the city began to reflect the supernatural corruption spreading below. Clouds formed in impossible configurations that hurt the eyes to observe directly. Rain fell upward in certain districts, while others experienced snowfall during the height of summer. The Tiber itself seemed affected, its waters sometimes flowing backward for hours at a time, while fish died in massive numbers for no apparent cause. Underground, in tunnels and chambers that had existed since before Rome's founding, ancient stones began to resonate with frequencies that could be felt rather than heard. Workers tasked with maintaining the city's sewers and aqueducts reported encounters with shadows that moved independently of their sources and voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. The transformation was not limited to supernatural phenomena. Political structures that had maintained stability for generations began to fracture in ways that seemed almost intentional. Senators who had been allies for decades suddenly turned against each other with a viciousness that shocked even Rome's cynical political class. Military commanders found their troops questioning orders that had never been disputed before. Trade relationships with provinces throughout the empire began to deteriorate as reports spread of strange occurrences in the capital. Merchants spoke of goods that spoiled without cause during transport to Rome, while others described cargo that arrived in better condition than when it had departed, as if some unseen force was selectively blessing or cursing commercial ventures. The entity's influence extended into the realm of knowledge itself. Scholars working in Rome's great libraries discovered that certain texts were changing, their words rearranging themselves into new configurations that revealed information that had never been written by human hands. Mathematical calculations that had been verified for centuries suddenly produced different results when performed within the city's boundaries. Corvus established what he called the Collegium Umbrae, a secret society of individuals who had been touched by the supernatural forces unleashed during the ritual. These weren't necessarily willing participants, but rather people who had been exposed to the entity's influence and found their perceptions permanently altered. They served as his network throughout the city, reporting on developments that ordinary citizens could not perceive. The Collegium included soldiers who could see the movements of enemy forces days before they appeared on the horizon, merchants who understood market fluctuations with supernatural precision, and artists whose works depicted scenes from times and places they had never experienced. Each member paid a price for their enhanced abilities, losing something essentially human in exchange for their expanded awareness. Among the Christian communities, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The increased persecution had indeed created martyrs, but these deaths were generating more than just conversions. They were creating individuals with abilities that their own leadership struggled to understand or control. Christians who had witnessed executions found themselves capable of healing that went beyond anything described in their scriptures, while others reported visions of future events with disturbing accuracy. The underground chambers where the original ritual had taken place became a focal point for these changes. The Etruscan inscriptions on the walls continued to evolve, new symbols appearing overnight, while others faded into illegibility. The altar itself had become something that existed partially outside normal space and time, its surface reflecting not the chamber around it, but scenes from various points in history and possible futures. Nero found himself compelled to return to the chamber regularly, drawn by a hunger that no amount of earthly pleasure could satisfy. Each visit left him more changed, more distant from his humanity. His courtiers noticed that he cast no reflection in certain mirrors, and that animals fled from his presence with instinctive terror. The emperor's public appearances became increasingly theatrical, as if he was performing not just for the Roman people, but for an audience that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. His speeches contained references to concepts that had no precedent in Roman thought, ideas that seemed to come from intelligences that viewed human civilization from perspectives spanning millennia. Corvus documented the emperor's transformation with clinical detachment, noting changes that occurred on levels beyond the merely physical. Nero's aura, visible to those with enhanced perception, had taken on qualities that belonged more to places than to people. He was becoming a living embodiment of the space between worlds, a human anchor for forces that existed outside the normal flow of reality. The effects of the ritual began to manifest in Rome's architecture itself. Buildings constructed after that night in 67 AD incorporated design elements that had no precedent in Roman engineering, yet somehow felt ancient and familiar to those who observed them. These structures seemed to channel and focus the supernatural energies that now flowed beneath the city like underground rivers. Citizens reported that certain buildings felt different inside than their external dimensions would suggest, as if the interior spaces had been folded or expanded according to geometric principles that defied conventional understanding. Rooms that should have been rectangular appeared perfectly circular to occupants, while others seemed to extend infinitely in directions that shouldn't exist. The gladiatorial schools began producing fighters whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. These weren't just skilled warriors, but individuals who seemed to anticipate their opponents' moves with supernatural precision and survive injuries that should have been fatal. The crowds that gathered to watch them fight felt an emotional intensity that went beyond mere entertainment, as if they were witnessing sacred rituals rather than secular spectacles. religious practices throughout the city began to blur together in ways that disturbed traditional authorities. Roman citizens found themselves drawn to Egyptian temples, while Greeks discovered meaning in Germanic ceremonial practices. The boundaries between different belief systems seemed to be dissolving, creating a syncretic spirituality that incorporated elements from traditions that had previously been incompatible. The entity's influence extended into the realm of time itself. Certain areas of the city began experiencing temporal anomalies where events occurred in non-linear sequences. Witnesses described seeing the same incident unfold multiple times with slight variations, or encountering people who claimed to remember conversations that had not yet taken place. Corvus established monitoring stations throughout Rome, staffed by members of the Collegium Umbrae, who tracked these disturbances and reported their findings through channels that bypassed normal governmental structures. These observations revealed patterns that suggested the entity's influence was spreading according to some vast design that encompassed not just Rome, but the entire Mediterranean world. The economic systems of the empire began to reflect supernatural influences as well. Trade routes that had been profitable for generations suddenly became hazardous, while previously dangerous paths opened up with unexpected opportunities. Currencies fluctuated according to patterns that had nothing to do with traditional market forces, as if wealth itself was being redistributed according to criteria that served purposes beyond human understanding. Military campaigns launched during this period achieved objectives that defied strategic logic, while others failed despite overwhelming advantages. Commanders reported receiving tactical insights through dreams or visions that proved devastatingly effective in battle, yet came with psychological costs that left them questioning their own humanity. The transformation of Rome was accelerating, driven by forces that operated according to timescales that dwarfed human lifespans. What had begun as a desperate emperor's bargain for political survival had evolved into something that threatened to reshape the fundamental nature of reality in the Mediterranean world. Citizens who possessed any degree of spiritual sensitivity found themselves caught between wonder and terror as they witnessed their familiar city becoming something entirely new. The Rome they had known was disappearing, replaced by a metropolis that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, where the boundary between the possible and the impossible had become increasingly meaningless. The Christian communities, despite facing intensified persecution, found their numbers growing at unprecedented rates. But these new converts brought with them abilities and insights that challenged the young religion's understanding of divine power. Church leaders struggled to distinguish between miracles granted by their God and supernatural phenomena that originated from sources they dared not name. The entity's promise that the binding was only the beginning was proving accurate in ways that even Corvus had not anticipated. Each day brought new manifestations of its influence, new evidence that the ritual in the underground chamber had initiated processes that would continue for centuries, reshaping not just Rome, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. As winter approached in the transformed year of 67 AD, those who understood what was happening began to realize that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history. The empire that had conquered the known world was itself being conquered by forces that operated according to rules that no human mind could fully comprehend. The true scope of what they had unleashed was still hidden from them, waiting to be revealed as the supernatural corruption that now flowed through Rome's foundations began to spread outward through the vast network of roads, aqueducts, and trade routes that connected the eternal city to every corner of the civilized world. But the most chilling discovery came when scholars began to decode the final entries in Corvus's encrypted journal, written during the last weeks of Nero's reign in 68 AD. The Haruspex Maximus had documented something that defied every assumption about the nature of their bargain with the Prince of Shadows. The entity had not been summoned at all. It had been waiting. According to Corvus's increasingly frantic notes, the being they had contacted in that underground chamber had been present beneath Rome since its founding. The ritual had not called it from some distant realm, but had simply awakened something that had been slumbering in the city's foundations for over 8 centuries, feeding slowly on the accumulated blood and suffering of Roman expansion. The 7 hills of Rome, Corvus realized with growing horror, had been chosen as the site of the city precisely because they formed a natural focusing array for supernatural energies. The Etruscans, who had ruled the region before Rome's rise, had known this, had in fact built their own civilization around the careful management of the forces that dwelt in the deep places beneath the earth. When Romulus and Remus established their city on those hills, they had unknowingly constructed their settlement directly above what Corvus described as a nexus point, a location where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. Every expansion of Roman territory, every conquest and colonization had fed power back into this central point, gradually strengthening the entity that waited below. The ritual in 67 AD had not created a new supernatural threat. It had simply provided the final key needed to unlock restraints that had held the Prince of Shadows in check for nearly a millennium. What followed was not possession or influence, but liberation. The implications were staggering. Every major event in Roman history, from the Punic Wars to the conquest of Gaul, from the crossing of the Rubicon to the assassination of Julius Caesar, had been guided by an intelligence that viewed human civilization as a vast feeding mechanism designed to accumulate the specific types of energy it required for its eventual awakening. Nero's desperate bargain had not saved his empire. It had doomed it, ensuring that when Rome finally fell, it would not simply collapse, but would be actively transformed into something that served purposes no human mind could fully grasp. The emperor himself had become increasingly aware of his true role as the ritual's effects deepened throughout 68 AD. What he had believed to be supernatural aid in crushing his enemies was revealed to be careful management of his empire's dissolution. Every apparent victory had actually accelerated Rome's internal decay, creating the conditions necessary for the entity's broader plans to unfold. Corvus documented Nero's final weeks with clinical precision, noting how the emperor's initial gratitude for supernatural assistance gradually transformed into horror as he realized the true nature of their agreement. The artifacts recovered from the ritual chamber had become more than tools of power. They had become anchors, binding both men to a destiny that extended far beyond their mortal lifespans. The Germanic dagger, now permanently black as night, had begun to whisper in languages that predated human speech. The fractured Persian mirror showed not just glimpses of possible futures, but windows into the entity's true realm, revealing landscapes of living shadow, where geometries followed rules that could drive observers to madness. The melted Egyptian amulet had reformed itself into shapes that hurt to look at directly, configurations that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. Most disturbing of all was the skull that had served as the focal point for the original summoning. It had continued to evolve throughout the months following the ritual, developing new cracks and fissures that followed patterns matching the expansion of supernatural influence throughout the empire. When the skull was completely fractured, Corvus predicted the entity's liberation would be complete. The network of the Collegium Umbrae had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, its members unknowingly serving as monitoring stations for an intelligence that was using the entire Roman Empire as a vast supernatural laboratory. Each member's enhanced abilities came with increasingly severe costs, as their humanity was gradually consumed by forces that required living anchors to maintain stability in the physical world. By spring of 68 AD, the transformation of Rome had progressed to the point where ordinary citizens could no longer ignore the supernatural elements that now permeated their daily lives. Markets sold goods that changed their fundamental properties overnight. Buildings rearranged their internal configurations without warning. The Tiber flowed with waters that reflected not the sky above, but scenes from other times and places entirely. The Christian communities had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the faith that had originally spread through the empire. Their enhanced abilities and supernatural insights had created a hybrid religion that incorporated elements from traditions that spanned millennia. Church leaders struggled to maintain doctrinal purity, while their congregations developed capabilities that seemed to operate according to rules that had nothing to do with their scriptures. The gladiatorial games had become ritualistic spectacles that served purposes far beyond entertainment. Each death in the arena contributed to a growing reservoir of spiritual energy that the entity channeled for its own mysterious objectives. The crowds that gathered to witness these events felt a connection to forces that transcended their individual existence, participating in ceremonies whose true meaning remained hidden from their conscious awareness. Military campaigns throughout the empire began to follow patterns that served the entity's agenda rather than Rome's strategic interests. Victories were won in locations that held particular significance for supernatural purposes, while defeats occurred in areas where Roman withdrawal would facilitate the spread of specific influences. Commanders found themselves making tactical decisions based on insights that came from sources they couldn't identify or understand. The economic systems of the Mediterranean world realigned themselves around flows of wealth that followed supernatural rather than commercial logic. Trade routes that had been profitable for generations suddenly became hazardous, while new pathways opened up that connected locations according to criteria that had nothing to do with geographic convenience or political stability. Corvus's journal entries from this period describe a civilization in the process of fundamental metamorphosis, transforming from a human empire into something that served as an instrument for intelligence that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. The changes were accelerating as the entity's influence spread through the vast network of Roman infrastructure, using roads, aqueducts, and administrative systems as conduits for supernatural energy. The scholar priest documented numerous instances of temporal distortion throughout the empire, areas where cause and effect followed non-linear patterns that suggested reality itself was being restructured according to principles that defied conventional understanding. Citizens reported encountering versions of themselves from different time periods, while others described witnessing historical events that had occurred decades or centuries earlier. Religious practices across the empire began to converge toward forms of worship that incorporated elements from traditions that had previously been incompatible. Roman citizens found themselves drawn to Egyptian mystery cults, while Greeks discovered meaning in Germanic ritual practices. The boundaries between different spiritual systems seemed to be dissolving, creating syncretic belief structures that served the entity's purposes more effectively than any single tradition could have achieved. As summer approached in 68 AD, the supernatural corruption that had begun in the chamber beneath Rome was nearing a critical threshold. The skull that had served as the focal point for the original ritual showed new fractures appearing daily, each crack corresponding to another barrier between dimensions growing weaker. Corvus calculated that complete fracture would occur within months, coinciding with what he described as the entity's final liberation from the constraints that had bound it since before human civilization began. Nero, increasingly aware of his role in facilitating Rome's transformation, made desperate attempts to reverse the process he had initiated. But the binding created during the eclipse ritual had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of intervention. The emperor found himself compelled to take actions that accelerated the empire's dissolution, even as he consciously sought to preserve it. The persecution of Christians intensified during this period, but paradoxically served to strengthen rather than weaken the supernatural forces at work throughout the empire. Each martyrdom created what Corvus described as resonance points, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms became temporarily permeable. These openings allowed the entity to extend its influence more directly into the world of human affairs. The Collegium Umbrae documented increasingly dramatic manifestations of supernatural activity as the year progressed. Entire districts of Rome experienced localized alterations in the flow of time, while others found their architectural layouts changing overnight according to patterns that followed non-Euclidean geometries. Citizens adapted to these changes with a flexibility that suggested their own consciousness was being gradually modified to accommodate realities that would have driven earlier generations to madness. Military units throughout the empire reported encounters with phenomena that had no precedent in Roman experience. Soldiers described battlefields where the dead continued fighting alongside the living, while others witnessed enemy forces that appeared to be composed entirely of living shadows. These accounts, initially dismissed as hallucinations or propaganda, became too numerous and consistent to ignore. The transformation reached its climax during the autumn of 68 AD as political upheaval throughout the empire created conditions that aligned perfectly with the entity's requirements for final liberation. Nero's suicide in June had removed the last human anchor for forces that no longer required mortal intermediaries to achieve their objectives. The carved skull in the ritual chamber developed its final fracture on the winter solstice, exactly 18 months after the original summoning. Corvus, now barely recognizable as the man who had first descended into those tunnels, documented the moment with observations that pushed the boundaries of human language to their breaking point. What emerged from the completely fractured skull was not a physical manifestation, but something far more profound and terrifying. It was liberation itself, the complete removal of barriers that had separated the entity's realm from the physical universe. Rome did not fall to barbarian invasions or internal corruption, as historians would later claim. It was systematically transformed into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, serving as a permanent gateway between worlds that had never been meant to intersect. The effects spread outward from Rome through the empire's vast network of roads and administrative systems, carrying the transformation to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Cities that had stood for centuries found their fundamental nature altered overnight, their populations adapting to new realities that incorporated elements from realms beyond human imagination. What historians call the fall of the Roman Empire was actually its successful evolution into something that served purposes far grander and more terrifying than mere human conquest. The entity that had slumbered beneath the Seven Hills for nearly a millennium had finally achieved the liberation it had patiently orchestrated through centuries of carefully managed human development. The ritual that began in desperation during a lunar eclipse in 67 AD had succeeded beyond its participants' wildest nightmares. But success, in this case, meant the end of human civilization as it had existed for millennia, and the beginning of an age where the boundaries between possible and impossible, between natural and supernatural, between human and inhuman, had been permanently dissolved. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, the evidence of what transpired in that underground chamber can still be found for those who know where to look and possess the courage to see what has been hidden in plain sight. The transformation that began with Nero's desperate bargain continues to unfold, guided by an intelligence that measures time in geological epochs and views human history as merely the first chapter in a much longer and more complex story. The Prince of Shadows walks freely in our world now, no longer confined to the depths beneath Rome, but present wherever the conditions it requires for continued expansion can be found. The ritual was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a process that spans millennia, and we are all living within the consequences of that ancient summoning, whether we realize it or not. What if I told you that every major historical event since 68 AD has been guided by the same intelligence that answered Corvus's call in that candlelit chamber? What if the rise and fall of civilizations, the spread of religions, the development of technologies that reshape human consciousness, all serve purposes that originated in that desperate midnight bargain between a failing emperor and forces older than recorded history? The hidden ritual that summoned the devil in Rome was not just successful, it was the beginning of everything that came after, and its effects continue to ripple through our world today, shaping our reality in ways we are only beginning to understand. The question is not whether the ritual worked, but whether humanity will ever be able to comprehend the full scope of what was unleashed when desperate ambition met ancient intelligence in the darkness beneath the eternal city.